Good afternoon and welcome to the Rumi Forum. This afternoon we are very privileged to have Ambassador Marc Parris speaking today, and he will be discussing the recent Obama visit to Turkey and the implications involved with that visit. And I have to just add that it's a real pleasure to be here with Ambassador Parris, because I know from experience that he is one of the most insightful scholars and individuals when it comes to modern Turkey, and he also pulls no punches whatsoever. So I look forward to his talk, and I look forward to the Q&A. Ambassador Parris.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. With apologies given the coziness of this forum, I'm going to speak from text this afternoon. Last time I did anything of this sort, the reports of my remarks got so garbled that I couldn't even understand them. So I'll speak from a text, I'll leave a text afterwards, and if anybody wants to refer to it, it'll be available from Rumi Forum. And my point of departure is probably what all of you read in your newspapers this morning, if people still read newspapers, over breakfast. And that is that the Obama administration has just completed its first 100 days in office. And our media is chock full of analysis of how the president and his team have done during this period. And that is perfectly normal, as anybody who's lived in Washington more than 4 years understands. What is not normal is how much there is to talk about with respect to Turkey in these first 100 days. American presidents generally figure out Turkey's importance to the United States. This president, Barack Obama, seems to have figured it out much sooner than his predecessors. It's worth considering why that's the case, and I'm grateful to Rumi Forum for giving me a chance to share some of my thoughts on the subject with you this afternoon. Now, an argument can be made that U.S.-Turkish relations under Barack Obama were simply doomed to succeed. The new president is not George Bush. That alone was always going to be a bounce in terms of the tone of our relations, as has proven to be the case not just in Turkey but in many countries around the world. The president's opening moves marked a sharp and, in Turkey and elsewhere, a welcome departure from some of his predecessors' more controversial policies. For example, his steps on Guantanamo and torture have gone far toward refurbishing the American brand name. The Bush administration itself, in its final years, had largely cleared away certain issues and attitudes that had done perhaps the most to sour this relationship. Things like the unexplainable, still unexplainable, delay in dealing with PKK terror out of northern Iraq. Things like criticism, at times quite sharp criticism, of Turkey's engagement with regional players, of which the Bush administration, at least initially, did not approve or think people should be talking to. Some would argue that partly because of Ankara's engagement with those players, Turkey's regional and broader influence had grown during the Bush years, so that its capacity as a strategic partner had become arguably greater than ever for the new administration. So the potential certainly existed for a significant rebound in U.S.-Turkish relations when the new administration took office on January 20. The question in my mind then, or whether the potential would be realized, however, was in my mind a function of two separate questions. Would the new team have the vision and the boldness to seize the strategic opportunity that today's Turkey represents? And would the new administration be able to avoid certain traps that could get it off on the wrong foot before the potential for partnership had been fully explored? Now, as we sit here today, I think we can answer those questions. So let me look at the traps first. The first trap, obviously, was the perennial issue of what to do, what to say about the Armenian question. The anniversary of what happened in 1915, of course, always comes precisely 93 days after any president takes office. It's a function of the calendar. April 24 this year, of course, loomed larger because of Obama's description of those events as genocide during the campaign and when he was in the Senate. The fact that he would be in Turkey precisely 16 days before the anniversary further raised the stakes. Now, I have no doubt that had the statement issued last week contained the word genocide, U.S.-Turkish relations would have gone into a deep freeze that would have taken years to thaw. Since it's clear from what the President said in his speech to the Turkish Parliament and last week that his personal views on the matter have not changed, the question is, what happened? Why did we get the result that we did? Two things I would suggest. First, I think the scheduling of the visit itself forced the President to focus sooner and more closely than would ordinarily have been the case on the consequences of using that word. And second, Turkey and Armenia, in a process that had begun well before the President took office, had created something to lose in terms of the possibility of an historic breakthrough in relations between those two countries. And so the result was the finesse that was expressed in last week's proclamation. Now, if the measure of success in such highly charged matters is the amount of flack that you catch from both sides, the Obama White House succeeded last week. Leaders in Turkey and in Armenia, to say nothing of the Armenian diaspora, have complained bitterly about the wording of the statement. But as far as I can tell, it has derailed neither prospects for refloating U.S.-Turkish partnership, nor for continuing the process of normalizing Turkish-Armenian relations. To paraphrase the Hippocratic Oath, it appears to have done no lasting harm. The second trap awaiting the new administration was a bit more subtle. It was reflected in a line of analysis and opinion that, I'm going to use a phrase you've heard in other contexts, had its roots during the Bush years and gained currency after Prime Minister Erdogan's outburst in Davos earlier this year. Proponents of this line have argued that Turkey's governments since 2002 have been essentially anti-Western in their outlook, and that they have systematically reoriented Turkish foreign policy onto an Islamist axis, at odds with U.S. and Western interests. The logical conclusion of this viewpoint was that the incoming administration should not reward Turkey's ruling party by an early visit to Turkey. Whatever the merits of this argument, and I have to confess I find them dubious, the Obama administration, by scheduling the visit, decisively rejected it. Indeed, the logic of the visit seems to be precisely that Turkey may be in a class by itself in terms of its ability to help or to hurt. More than most countries, the new administration, as it seeks to cope with the mess it inherited from its predecessor. This is in the no-holds-barred category, I guess. It's worth noting that a lot of that mess is adjacent to Turkey or in countries where Turkey has particular influence, like Pakistan, Afghanistan. Rightly or wrongly, the President and his team appear to have concluded that they do not have the luxury of holding off engagement with Turkey until Ankara has somehow proven the negative that it is not our enemy. And they're almost certainly right. So much for the traps. They are now, as best as I can tell, behind us, although the genocide issue, without question, will be back. What about the other question I posed a moment ago? Would the new administration have the combination of boldness and foresight to seize the opportunity Turkey today represents? Excuse me 1 second. This is not swine flu.
Get your Schultz.
Thank you. Now, I suppose the fact that the administration has avoided the traps that I identified is a partial and an affirmative answer to this question, but let me approach it by a somewhat different path. Some of you may recall that last fall I wrote a couple of articles, respectively for Insight Turkey and Tusiad's Private View, that made some concrete suggestions on how the new administration could get Turkey right after the unfortunate experiences of the Bush years. I'm not going to repeat my suggestions point by point, partly because not all of them have been acted upon. The thrust of what I proposed, however, was that we needed to elevate the management of our relations with Turkey above the bureaucratic no man's land to which it is often consigned by the division of our national security apparatus into categories that just don't fit Turkey. Europe, the Near East, South Asia, etc., etc. The antidote, I argued in my articles, is high-level involvement, and lots of it. An agenda that reflects the full range of our overlapping interests, and mechanisms for consultation and coordination that are engaged long before we find ourselves in a crisis. What have we seen since January? We've seen Hillary Clinton visit Ankara in her first month on the job and announce that Barack Obama would be right behind her. That act alone, I would suggest, breathed new life into a common vision statement reaffirmed during her visit that had largely been viewed as a paper exercise during the Bush years. Announcing the president's going to come in connection with that kind of an action gives it a whole different context and a much more meaningful one. We've seen the president's trip itself, which, as I've described in the context of the Armenian proclamation, gave Barack Obama himself ownership of this relationship at the outset of his administration in a way that has quite simply never been done before. It took Bill Clinton 8 years to get to Turkey. George Bush never made a bilateral visit. He was there for a multinational conference. In its first 100 days, between the president's parliament speech and the reissued vision statement, this administration has rolled out a coherent, authoritative, self-standing Turkey policy, just as they said they were going to do during the campaign. Again, that has never happened before. Any doubt that the president's visit would be a one-shot affair has been dispelled by what has happened before and since he was there. George Mitchell has been in Turkey twice since taking up his new responsibilities. Admiral Mullins was there last week, making clear, in case anybody doubted it, that the traditional ties between the United States and Turkey's defense establishments are once again sound. FBI Director Mueller has visited. Richard Morningstar, our new energy special envoy, met last week in Sofia with President Gül and Energy Minister Güler. Senior Turkish foreign policy managers have been in Washington repeatedly during this period. In all of the exchanges that have taken place thus far, the American side, by all the accounts that I've heard, has been true to its public declarations of readiness to listen to and to be responsive to Turkish viewpoints and concerns. The approach genuinely seems to be, we have a common problem, how can we best address it together, instead of, we want what we want when we want it. So you put it all together, and I think the inescapable conclusion is that we are in a new ballgame. This is a relationship that is now being managed at the very top levels of our government. The traditional bureaucratic turf battles appear to have been eclipsed by an unusually clear sense of the importance of forging strong, productive working relationships between U.S. senior policy officials and their Turkish counterparts. In fact, in some cases, this is happening before the people who would normally have responsibility for running the relationship have even been confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Consultation is happening, and machinery seems to be coming into being or being revived to institutionalize what has been, in historical terms, a dazzlingly fast set of opening moves. What hasn't changed is the basic U.S.-Turkish agenda. That is why it is possible to dust off a Bush-era vision document, reissue it, and go on from there. Ali Babacan likes to tell the story that in his first meeting with Condoleezza Rice a year or so ago, he proposed that each of them write down on a piece of paper their top 10 priorities. As the minister tells the story, the lists were identical, except that the American list included North Korea and his didn't. Now that Turkey's on the Security Council, that may have changed. Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Arab-Israeli problem, energy security, Turkish-EU relations, the Caucasus, transnational problems like drugs, human trafficking, and weapons of mass destruction and proliferation are all issues that are important to both America and Turkey. By and large, we want to see these matters come out in the same place. That doesn't mean they will, or that we and the Turks will always agree on how to get there. I'm willing to predict some fairly sharp differences will emerge on things like the balance of carrots and sticks for Iran, on the role groups like Hamas should have in Israeli-Palestinian discussions, on a lot of issues relating to energy. Partnership implies differences in perspective, but it also implies a readiness to invest the time, the effort, and the capital to find win-win solutions. That's what has been too often missing for a variety of reasons in U.S.-Turkish relations in recent years. Barack Obama's offer during his stay in Turkey of a so-called model partnership suggests that he and his foreign policy team understand this and that they are ready to do what they can to make a difference in the years ahead. Now, to my mind, that is as good a start as could have been hoped for, and the only issue for me is whether they continue to build on such a strong start in the weeks and months and years ahead. I'm going to stop there. I realize it's a little shorter than my normal disquisition, but looking around this room, I suspect there will be lots of probing questions, and I'm at your disposal.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much, and I'm sure that there will be many questions, and while we get the microphone ready, I'll take advantage of that to ask the first question, and that is, if in fact we are doomed to succeed, which is sort of a foreboding quality to it, and you speak about this partnership, and there's been lots of talk over the years about partnership, and rarely has it been anything approaching that. It has been a highly unbalanced relationship. If you want to pick 2 or 3 areas to begin out, to begin with, and to build out, I should say, this partnership, what would you choose in terms of areas where we could establish the framework for true partnership in a meaningful way that would then set the stage for a continuation along other lines?
Well, I mean, you don't have to wonder very much. It's in the vision statement. It's in the things that the president has talked about while he was in Turkey. I ran through a list of issues that I thought represent the agenda, and I don't think it's a matter of picking out 1 or 2, but of applied, disciplined, sustained effort on the range of them. None of the things that I mentioned are things that we have the luxury of putting off to some second stage in hopes that it'll get easier and that we can focus on the priority stuff. I mean, I think that there will be a natural tendency first to look at the most acute problems, and Afghanistan, Pakistan is obviously one of them, and there's a whole range of things. I would say particularly in the area of soft power, where Turkey can be helpful, given its historical relationship with both of those countries, given its demonstrated ability to be a convener, which we saw just the week before President Obama visited Turkey, when the presidents of Pakistan and Afghanistan responded to President Gül's invitation to come to Turkey. I can't think of another country in the world that could have done that, other than perhaps ourselves. I think that energy is an obvious area where Washington's attention will quickly focus on Turkey's importance. We've essentially been out of this game for 8 years after the successes of building Baku Ceyhan and its gas equivalent during the late Clinton administration. What needs to happen is we need to begin to build a record of success together. That is what happened in the 90s, in the second Bill Clinton administration. And by the end of that period, strategic partnership wasn't just a slogan. You could look at the situation in the Balkans, you could look at energy security, you could look at a whole range of issues on which, in very concrete terms, the United States and Turkey had made a difference in terms of the achievement of one another's important interests. That's what partnership is, and if it's not producing those results, arguably it's not a partnership. Right. It's about win-win results, and it's about the ability of leaders on both sides to stand up and be able to cite in fairly concrete terms what our partner has done for us lately. Again, it would have been very hard, I think, for Recep Tayyip Erdogan for much of the last 6 or 8 years to stand up in front of a Turkish audience and describe what George Bush had done for him lately. Right. To him maybe, but for him is a harder call. So you got to start somewhere. This is an awfully strong start in getting back to that kind of a relationship. The proof will be in the execution, as it always is.
And the public's reception.
The public, I'm convinced, will respond positively to success. Success means being able to say what your partner's done for you lately, right. I would argue.
Great. Gentleman right here.
Yes, sir.
There we go, right there.
Oh, it's on. Okay. Hi, I'm Bob Pace, of no
former colleague.
Yes, a former colleague. Mr. Ambassador, the point of departure for my question is a phenomenon with which you're very familiar, and that is that in the past, whenever a senior Turkish official said, as one did recently, that we're in a golden era of U.S.-Turkish relations, or that our relations are the best they've ever been, immediately afterwards our relations went downhill, which is the sad truth. And my question then is, agreeing with what you've said, what are the potential pitfalls, and where could this beautiful scenario go wrong?
Well, I mean, the problem with what the Obama administration has done in its first 100 days is it set the bar of expectations very high, and so it will probably be relatively easy to miss some of those expectations on both sides. That said, if you look at the people involved on both sides, you have what at this point is quite an experienced Turkish foreign policy team. The incoming administration in the United States, where you would normally expect some softness and lack of experience, it's quite a different picture. When you're talking about Holbrooks and Mitchells and the whole array of people that have been brought on board, it's very impressive. These are people that know how the world works. And I think that's one of the reasons that you got this early visit, is that they do know how the world works, and they understand Turkey's intrinsic importance to so many of the challenges that we face. But as I suggested briefly in my remarks, we're not going to agree on every particular point. And it is the case that people will fixate on any gap in nuance or substance and make it a big deal. We've already seen one example. Is Turkey going to respond to America's diktat for more troops in Afghanistan? Well, I suspect the question was never put in those terms. Based on what I've seen thus far, I doubt that the question will be put in those terms. But it's easy for a perception to emerge on the Turkish side that there go the Americans again acting like the last administration, and on the American side, the Turks have let us down because they're not fielding a combat brigade. I think what's important in a situation like that is that spokespersons on both sides be able and quick to put these things in the proper context. Turkey has already made and is making an enormous contribution in Afghanistan. Its potential to make a contribution in Pakistan is enormous. I have no doubt whatsoever that the administration will be extremely grateful for the combination of hard and soft power that Turkey represents. As we get into the discussion of energy, what role Russia will play is something that is going to have to be resolved. Turkey's perception of that role, I suspect, is going to be different as we get into the discussion than it was in the late 90s, when we were largely working together to build an east-west corridor that would give the countries of Central Asia and the Caspian alternative routes that didn't go through the former Soviet Union, that didn't go through Russia specifically. So those kinds of issues are out there. They will be magnified. Based on the start that's been made, one can only hope that they will be managed as effectively as the launch has been.
Great. We have another question back here.
My name is Ziad Al-Haddad, the former Director of Operations at the World Bank and also Head of Office for Turkey. And I had the privilege of serving Turkey while you were the ambassador.
I remember the name, yes. Nice to see you again.
And can I turn the conversation to the economic side for a minute? Turkey is doing relatively well on the economic front, and it's a member of the G20, well deserved. But there is an issue which I think you were well aware of and very sensitive to when you were ambassador, and that's the disparity or the distribution of wealth between East and West. And there was a lot of American efforts, very visible, some of them, to in fact improve the position of the East and the Southeast Turkey particularly. The Mayor's Conference, which you and I chaired at one stage. Where do you stand, where do you see the American position now vis-a-vis that same issue on improving the well-being of the Southeast and in fact creating a Turkey which has a more even distribution of wealth and income?
Well, clearly the problem isn't solved. And clearly the needs in that part of Turkey are still great. A couple of things have changed. I mean, Turkey is a much wealthier country with a great deal more intrinsic capability of its own to deal with some of those issues. The ruling party, by all accounts, appears to have tried very hard to have made a difference on the ground in the run-up to March 29th, without commenting on how successful that approach was. I haven't been to the Southeast since I left Turkey, except for a brief climb up a mountain or two, and that was some years ago. But I have the impression that there has been progress made, that the situation is much improved from when I was there a decade ago as ambassador when we chaired our conference. I don't know the answer to the question of how the new administration will engage on what the Prime Minister has called the Kurdish question, and exactly what the impact of the economic crisis will be on the Turkish government's own ability to deal with the developmental issues that you've raised. I think that people in Washington with whom I have had interaction have been encouraged by some of the progress that has been made in helping Turkish citizens who happen to be of Kurdish ethnic background in that part of the country and elsewhere throughout Turkey not feel so much like second-class citizens, to become more part of the national fabric, and are encouraged by some of the statements by political and non-political leaders that seems to be moving slowly but clearly towards a more sophisticated way of dealing with this problem than has been the case in the past. This is work in progress. Clearly, for any foreign power to inject itself into so sensitive an issue, you have to be very careful. You have to have good bona fides. So it's going to take some time, I suspect, for this new administration to get to that level of detail and come up with an approach which will be as well developed as it may have out of the box on some of these other issues that I've been talking about. It's not a crisp answer to your question, but I'm not sure there is one. Thank you.
We have a question down here in the front, gentleman right here. Yes. And then back to you. Sorry for the confusion.
Thank you. I'm Don Kaufman, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer.
I'm aware of that.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Ambassador, you talked about changes on the American side. Have there been changes on the Turkish side toward the relationship, or do you expect them?
You mean in terms of dynamics or personalities?
Yes.
Well, in terms of personalities, I guess we have to wait till tomorrow if that's when the cabinet reshuffle is going to take place. I mean, the Turkish foreign policy team has not changed a lot since they came to power in 2002. There have been some adjustments here and there, but it's essentially been the same personalities. And I think that will probably be the case as we go forward. In terms of dynamics, I mean, I think that we have gone through varying phases over the past 6 or 8 years, which have reflected, to a large extent, current American policy and practice around Turkey's borders. Clearly the relationship had a different feel in the summer of 2003 than it did last year. You could go back to the period when phenomena like metal storm, etc., were sort of prominent in their weight in Turkish popular culture of the moment. My sense is that even before President Obama went there, before he was elected, that had begun to attenuate a good deal. I think I give Condoleezza Rice actually, and a lot of credit for having gone to Turkey early in the second Bush administration, established a relationship with Abdullah Gül and others, including the Prime Minister, early on, which paid dividends in terms of managing the relationship better in the final years, and to getting relief on things which simply poisoned the relationship up to that point, such as the PKK question. So there are no constants in foreign policy in Turkey or anywhere else, and I think that depending on when you tune in, this is either a darker or a brighter picture. It has been brightening, but I think that the candle power has really been turned up since November, and particularly since the beginning of the year.
Thank you. The very patient gentleman with the green striped shirt in the back.
Mr. Ambassador, given the statements of President Obama on the 24th and everything you've shared, I was just wondering when you think is the right time for the U.S. to recognize the Armenian genocide.
Well, I mean, I've seen American Armenian figures quote my Wall Street Journal article to the effect that there may never be a good time for one country's legislature to pass judgment on another country's history. And I stand by that statement. I think that the spirit that enlivened President Obama's statements in Turkey and the proclamation that was released is that while the past is important and can't be forgotten, and while some of the feelings that the past still generates are legitimate, there are important realities having to do with today and tomorrow that ought to be addressed. And the question is, in my mind, as a pragmatist on these things, is this gesture, is this kind of a statement going to improve or undercut prospects for the success of those processes, whether it's the process of an internal Turkish debate, which has grown in intensity and detail and concreteness on what happened and what they should do about it, or whether it's the discussions between the Armenians and the Turks themselves. So I'm not prepared to say when there will be a time that the president should say the G word. That's not the way my mind works, and that's not the way I've tried to address the issue in the past.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Ambassador Parris, can you hear?
Yes.
My name is Albert Nikimkin. I wonder if you have any recommendations to the new administration in the area of public diplomacy, and especially for the purpose of rolling back this heavy anti-Americanism that's been affecting the Turkish public.
Well, I mean, based on what we've seen in the last 100 days, I don't think these guys need any lessons in public diplomacy from me, or maybe anybody. They're good at it. They're very good at it. And I haven't seen any recent polls, but I know that there was already a bounce after November in terms of perceptions of America as opposed to perceptions of George Bush. And I would guess that after the visit, the numbers are, you know, significantly better than they were a year ago. And so long as the two sides can build on the start that they've made, I would expect that that would continue. As I said a second ago, popular opinion responds to success. But success isn't something that's abstract. Success is, you know, being able to do something about the PKK when they're killing Turks. Success is getting pipelines built. Success is making Turkey an energy hub in a way that's responsible and meets the needs of Europe and the broader West and its neighbors. So I think the best guarantee that this doesn't slip backward is for the substance to move forward in a way that that reflects the start that's been made.
We have one question here and then one over there.
My name is Kevin Slayton. I'm from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Do the United States and Turkey share a similar interest in the issue in Israel and Palestine? And specifically, I mean, do they share the same outcome? Do they see a common vision? And if so, what can they do in this partnership to bring about that vision more specifically? Thank you.
I think broadly speaking, they do have a common vision of a good outcome. I mean, it's impossible for Turkey to get wrapped into the question of whether Israel's a Jewish state, because they recognized it in 1948 and they've had diplomatic relations with it ever since, and as best I can tell, it's not an issue for them. So you can put that aside, and that appears to be at the moment one of the principal questions on the agenda between Israel and the Palestinians. In terms of a general and a lasting peace, I think that we're on exactly the same page. Turkey is maybe the only country in the world that has had the experience that we did of trying to broker Israelis and Syrians on some of those tough issues. I think that they've probably learned from it many of the lessons that we did in terms of the intrinsic difficulty of doing that, and some of the in terms of the intractability of some of the problems. So there will be differences in terms of tactics, I'm sure. We, America, the Obama administration, generally speaking, I think remains skeptical about the notion that Hamas has a contribution to make to an Israeli-Palestinian dialogue, either as a member of the government, unless it changes certain of its positions, or in any other capacity until it changes many of its practices. Turkey has a different view, and they're not ashamed of it, and they believe that it's added value at certain points. And reasonable people, it seems to me, can disagree over that kind of thing without being different in where they want to see the process come out. And I think both can exist together. There were periods during the discussions in January to establish a ceasefire when Turkey's ability to talk to Hamas was clearly an important factor in getting to yes on that. I can envision situations like that cropping up again. I hope not in quite such violent terms. But creative diplomacy can sometimes take advantage of these kinds of situations, even if they're not right for you in terms of your comfort level. So I think the answer to your question is, by and large, yes, we do share the same objectives, and the fact that George Mitchell has been there twice suggests that he views what Turkey has to offer as added value as well. He wouldn't waste his time otherwise.
Thank you. The gentleman from the next room.
Hello.
Hi.
Dear Ambassador, this is Ermal Ipe, a graduate student at the University of Maryland. And my question was, well, a twofold question. There have been a few lines of tension in the Turkish political playground for the past, I don't know how many decades, but notably for the last 2 decades, that has been between the secular establishment and this emerging, economically prosperous Anatolian middle class, whose aspirations have been arguably, up to now, best represented by the AK party. And a few flare-ups have happened in the past decade or so. So the first question is, do you predict another flare-up? And the second is, well, in the near future, and to the best of your fortune-telling capacity. And the second question is, what would you predict the role of the United States would be, as opposed to the last time when Secretary Rice said the United States supports democracy in Turkey, which is pretty generic and doesn't really contribute that much to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, I'm afraid my crystal ball isn't clear enough to be able to predict with any confidence on my part whether there will be further, as you refer to them, flare-ups, or along what fault lines. Clearly, Turkey, like any other society, is a society in evolution. If foreign policy is not a constant, no society is static. So, you know, the changes have occurred, and Turkey's political system has evolved already, I think, in important ways to deal with the changes that have taken place in the last couple of decades, and presumably will continue to do so. Exactly how, exactly, you know, which directions, I think it's we should be humble, particularly sitting here in another country, in terms of predicting how it's going to happen. Under the best of circumstances, that's difficult work. So we will have to see. In terms of the extent to which Turkey's internal developments will become a subject on which the United States takes an interest and expresses a view. Again, I don't know the answer to the question in terms of what the administration will do. It obviously depends upon the circumstances. But as a general rule, democratic administrations in our country have been often more willing than their Republican counterparts to address internal developments where they involve human rights, where they involve freedom of expression issues, where they involve deviations from the rule of law. So if you look at this from a historical perspective, it is conceivable, again, depending upon what happens in Turkey, that you would find that this administration would be more inclined than others in its annual human rights report and in other ways to address these kinds of events should they occur and as they occur. You know, it doesn't mean that they've come into office on a witch hunt or looking for trouble, but it may be that as Democrats they will be more inclined than under the last administration if there is an event that poses a challenge to the notion of Turkey as a successful functioning democracy. They might very well feel more inclined to comment than the predecessors had.
Ambassador Pearson, thank you so much, as always, for your insights.